Welcome to today's explainer. You've probably heard the phrase a million times. Keep your nose to the grindstone. It's just one of those everyday pieces of advice we throw around when it's time to knuckle down, focus, and get to work. But what's really fascinating is that this completely common idiom harbors a surprisingly dark, 5-century-old history. And hidden right there, inside that history, is an incredibly profound psychological lesson about human perseverance.
So let's just stop and ask the obvious question here. Why on earth do we put our noses to grindstones? I mean, think about it literally for a second. A grindstone is this massive, spinning wheel of incredibly rough rock used to sharpen steel. The idea of putting your actual face anywhere near that sounds, well, absolutely terrifying. Yet somehow, this exact dangerous imagery has become our ultimate mental model for grit and determination.
To really understand why, we can look to a guiding philosophy from a man affectionately known as Papa Q-Bear, who was the author's father. Whenever his son was just overwhelmingly frustrated with a really difficult task, you know that feeling when you're on the absolute verge of throwing your hands up and giving up, Papa Q-Bear would simply look at him and say, "Keep your nose to the grindstone." It wasn't just a bossy demand to work harder, it was a genuine plea to push through the intense discomfort of learning something new. And that advice hits the nail on the head when it comes to what we call the beginner's paradox. This is the uncomfortable, unavoidable reality that to achieve true mastery in literally anything, you must first be willing to be a beginner. And let's be honest, being a beginner hurts. It really does. It requires pushing your mind through this thick, heavy friction of clumsiness, frustration, and even a little bit of embarrassment. But let's take a step back. What physical friction actually gave birth to this crazy metaphor in the first place? Well, historians generally point to two rival theories. On one side, we have the miller's tale, which suggests the phrase comes from grain millers who had to keep their noses incredibly close to grinding stones just to smell if the grain was burning. On the other side, we have the tool sharpener theory, pointing to blade sharpeners hunching over their spinning wheels to sharpen metal. Well, spoiler alert, the miller's tale is officially busted. Etymologists have dug into this and found that historically, millers used millstones, not grindstones. In fact, texts dating all the way back to the year 1400 explicitly distinguish between those two very different tools. If this phrase actually came from milling grain, we'd all be walking around telling each other to keep our noses to the millstone. Instead, the origin is far more intense. The phrase was born directly from the brutal reality of Georgian-era tool sharpeners. Picture a massive, heavy, spinning wheel of stone. To get a steel blade perfectly sharp, these workers had to hunch directly over the wheel for back-breaking hours, keeping their faces mere inches from that rough spinning surface. Why? Because if they left the steel on the stone even a fraction of a second too long, it would overheat and ruin the blade completely. They quite literally had to keep their noses to the grindstone just to survive the workday. And that historical reality shows us just how dark this phrase originally was. Consider these words written by English reformer John Frith all the way back in 1532. He wrote, "This text holdeth their noses so hard to the grindstone that it clean disfigureth their faces." Yeah, 500 years ago, this absolutely wasn't a cute motivational poster you'd hang in an office. It was a phrase used to describe sheer cruelty, an act of torture or immense coercion designed to break a person down. But it's fascinating to watch how the meaning shifted as the centuries rolled by. In 1532, it was this cruel physical punishment inflicted upon you. By 1828, so almost 300 years later, it started to soften. It became reflexive. It meant you were choosing to put your own nose to the stone to get your work done. And in our modern era, it's completely transformed. It's now a badge of honor, a real celebration of quiet, daily human persistence. Which brings us right back to a really beautiful everyday analogy. The physical friction of that massive stone perfectly mirrors the mental friction of learning. Think about what a grindstone actually does. It takes a completely dull, unrefined piece of metal, subjects it to intense friction, heat, and pressure, and transforms it into a razor-sharp, highly precise tool. Well, the friction of the beginner's paradox works exactly the same way on our brains. Whether you're learning a new language, starting a totally new career, or picking up a complex hobby, that mental friction feels rough and deeply uncomfortable. But make no mistake, that exact friction is what is sharpening your mind. So how do we actually overcome the beginner's paradox? It comes down to 3 distinct steps. First, face the frustration and fear. Just acknowledge that the friction is going to be there. Second, apply quiet daily discipline.
You don't get a sharp blade by smashing a piece of steel against a rock one time. It takes consistent, steady pressure over time. And finally, you achieve mastery. By enduring that friction, all the dullness falls away, and a highly refined skill emerges.
Let's lock in exactly what we've covered today. This common idiom started out as a literal description of 16th century cruelty before slowly evolving into our modern badge of self-discipline. It serves as a fantastic, stark reminder of the beginner's paradox. We absolutely have to face that initial frustration because enduring the heavy friction of the learning phase is quite simply the only path to achieving true mastery.
And I'd like to leave you with a warm reflection inspired by Papa Q. Gare. When he told his son to keep his nose to the grindstone, he wasn't just telling him to work hard. He knew the ultimate secret. The outcome in the end is always worth it. That intense friction, it doesn't last forever. But the mastery you build, that does. So I have to ask you, what is the dull blade in your life right now? And what grindstone are you going to willingly put your nose to today? Thanks so much for exploring these ideas with us, and whatever you're working on, keep persevering.